Hey everybody, June 5th, 1981 was a day that we'll never forget, especially in the LGBT community. The CDC published the world's first clinical report on what became AIDS in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which made mention of the pneumocystic pneumonia affecting gay men, which would later be known as HIV/AIDS. That same day, the Los Angeles Times ran a story about the CDC report and became the first mainstream newspaper to cover the new disease. To look back at the last 40 years at how HIV/AIDS has been depicted in television and film, we brought together a very distinguished panel tonight to discuss the situation. Do you want to?
So my name is Craig Hardesty, and I am the board chair of Out on Film. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And I am here hosting tonight with my husband, Jim Farmer.
I'm the festival director.
The festival director of Out on Film. And we're thrilled tonight to be talking to Mark S. King, who is a former Atlantan and has been writing and speaking about his life with HIV for more than 30 years. And 2020 was a great year for Mark. He won the 2020 GLAAD Award and was named the LGBTQ Journalist of the Year. Mark, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Mark.
You're very welcome.
Stephen Igarashi-Ball, who is a native of Georgia, along with my husband, having grown up in the metro Atlanta area, and he is widely recognized as an activist, educator, and fundraiser. And Stephen serves as the assistant events and teams manager for AIDS Atlanta, where he has been for 12 plus years and helps coordinate the largest HIV/AIDS fundraiser in the Southeast. Been a featured speaker at conferences on AIDS, and a contributing author at the National HIV Prevention Conference, and fundraising efforts have generated millions of dollars. Stephen, welcome to Out on Film, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for one of our panelists.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. One of our panelists has not joined us yet. Hopefully he'll join us later, but we thank you for doing this. So I wanted to basically just start off talking about what it was like back then after that first announcement, and what those first years were like in terms of what Hollywood was putting forth and the messages that those early films were. Let me some of the movies that came out shortly after that would be An Early Frost on television from 1985, a real early episode of Saint Elsewhere, Buddies in 1985, Tongues Untied in 1989, and Parting Glances in 1996. 1986, right. And then obviously Longtime Companion in 1989. What kind of messages did this first wave of films send?
Oh, well, it was kind of like the best of times, the worst of times. In other words, there was a lot of good that was being done. The Hollywood was kind of being a good, responsible public health partner early on by at least putting the content out there. I mean, you had major stars, Jenna Rollins, starring in
in an
early TV movie, Early Frost. Thank you very much. The Early Frost. I mean, you had major talent associated, the two male leads, major talent associated with it. And they did a good job of reflecting the fact that this was a disease for whom you should have compassion. But they also showed the ignorance. The partner of the guy who had HIV, there's a scene where he's taking his dishes and he's about to take a sip of his drink, and he doesn't. Even though we knew by then that you couldn't get it that way, they showed his own fear and ignorance. And that was really an honest reflection of where we were at the time. So you look at the earliest stuff, especially Buddies, which was this small independent movie that only kind of got re-earthed, recently, and Parting Glances, and there was humor and a very dark black humor to them, which I appreciated because there was a lot of that going on at the time. It's also true that the country was super focused on white gay men, and Hollywood and the people in power and the people with the ability to tell the stories were focused on white gay men. Because can you believe it would happen to nice guys like us, know? And so you didn't get any storylines that had to do with addiction or had to do with transgender black women or any of that. They really stayed focused on that which they thought was the easiest sell to sell their Clorox bleach, right? So that's what was going on in the earliest days. Good messaging in a lot of cases, not very diverse.
And with that, I mean, and even though a lot of people did try, I mean, I think that Parting Glances kind of started to show how we could live and still be operating, but also it was focused on, I don't want to say that the nice gays, but the professional white, you know, who other than having sex did nothing else to contract the disease. I mean, it was a very sanitized version of a very good message that needed to get out because nobody else was talking.
Yeah. Well, and I also want to say, if anybody wants to see a fantastic, very early Steve Buscemi performance, go see, watch Parting Glances when he's basically a kid with AIDS. He's amazing in it. But you're right. Yes.
Stephen, what were your thoughts on the movies that came out in the 80s and what Hollywood was trying to
get? So I'm just a little bit younger, and so in 81 I would have been 3. But what's interesting to me is, so I am pop culture obsessed. I love film and television and all of that. So I knew at an early age I was gay, and so I remember seeing a lot of those films, you know, when I was in like middle or high school, and having grown up in an era of AIDS and always having been told, you know, that it was safe sex or no sex. And it was really kind of drilled into your head that basically, like, if you had unprotected sex, you were going to get AIDS and die. So I think for me, even though, we didn't have a lot of portrayals of gay people at all, even in any aspect, but those portrayals, even though film caught on early and was covering it early, and even if they were covering it in a negative way, I think there were a lot of negative, long-lasting ramifications because, you know, Mark was talking about seeing someone like not want to drink out of a glass after someone, even when we knew that that wasn't how AIDS was transmitted. You have people like myself seeing these films years after they've been made because they're some of the only content that is available, and it's perpetuating those myths and those stigmas because there was nothing to correct it, you know. So in some ways I think it was great because being young and closeted and, you know, in Gwinnett County, I was grasping for anything that I could get that had any kind of representation and visibility. But in other ways, it reinforced all of the fears that you had about yourself and all of the negative things that media was telling you and, you know, that church was telling you and things like that. So it was negative in those sort of ways. But I think one of the first films that I really related to was Jeffrey. Because I felt like it addressed fears and the threat of HIV or the worry of HIV. But it also featured a lot of people who were really just kind of encouraging the main character that, like, you need to get on with your life and, like, you can't let fear control you, and you know that there are people who will love you regardless of what happens to you, you know. And so, like, we can't live lives that are dictated by fear and stigma and all of that. So I think that for me, it was kind of a balance of those things. And then obviously, you know, I know it's not film, but with television, seeing things like Pedro on The Real World when I was, I think I was in high school at the time. And I grew up on soap operas. And I remember seeing on All My Children, a character who was HIV positive, but she was heterosexual and she had gotten it through a blood transfusion, you know. And so I thought it was great to see just media representing things that were outside of the gay experience to reinforce that it's not just gay people who deal with this issue.
Yeah.
You know, I think I want to interject and say, first of all, Stephen, he didn't say that he'd not seen these movies. He said that he saw them later when he was old enough to watch a mature movie like that. So I was about to say, I'm going to buy you an Amazon Prime account so you can see these movies, but you've seen them. You just saw them later.
I have seen them. In fact, thank you so much to Out on Film, because I saw Buddies at an event that you hosted just, I think maybe like 2 years ago. And it was revelatory to me to see something like that even now. And to know that something like that was put out so early in the pandemic, like that actually kind of gave me some relief, I think.
It's an artifact. It's an artifact, and it was a real-time artifact. Buddies was about a guy being a buddy, a volunteer buddy to a guy dying of AIDS. That is exactly what was happening. I remember I did that. I was a buddy in real time. So that was essentially a documentary, you know, of this going on. Much like, by the way, Silver Lake: The View from Here, which was a documentary about the last days of a guy's life who was dying of AIDS, and they actually show him dying. But I gotta say, I want to give a lot of love to Stephen's love for Jeffrey, because Jeffrey was a real, and I want to get back to your original question about those early years, but I have to skip to 1995 when Jeffrey came out and say, what an amazing, just turning of the corner, a completely different, because here you had in Jeffrey, first of all, you had, what's his name, Steven Weber, I think, from Wings, the popular actor from the TV series Wings, who was super cute. And what they essentially made was a romantic comedy. They made a romantic comedy. You have, what's his name, from the Broadway actor, the producer, from the producers, Nathan Lane, young Nathan Lane is in Jeffrey, and he's hilarious. And it's a romantic comedy, except the girl sidekick is Nathan Lane, the gay sidekick. And it's hilarious and funny and super dark. It gets real dark because the nature of the movie is, it came out in 95 before the new meds came. People were still dying, right? 50 million people had died. And here you have this gay, colorful, romantic comedy, and the plot is he's trying not to have sex because he doesn't want to die. Right. That's the plot of a gay romantic comedy, and they get away with it. It's great. It's loving. It's wonderful. It's sweet.
Yeah.
So I love Jeffrey.
Jeffrey is a great movie. And all transparency, I mentioned earlier, one of our panelists couldn't make it. I did not intend this to be an all-white panel discussing all-white films, but that's unfortunately the way it turned out. I did want to talk a little bit about Tongues Untied in 1989, because that was the first film that dealt with HIV and AIDS, that dealt with Black protagonists. And, you know, I just want to talk to you both. Why haven't there been a whole lot more films that deal with Black protagonists?
Because Black men weren't making decisions. I mean, weren't in the decision-making power. Tongues Untied was a renegade production. It was totally maverick. It was not a studio film at all. It was a guy and his camera doing experimental art. You know, it was like it was like an artist doing graffiti outside on the wall. You know, that was who. You know, Marlon Riggs was basically Banksy, you know, as a Black gay man trying to tell his story out there any way he could. And he didn't have funding. He didn't have, you know, his Tongues Untied, I remember it coming out 1989, and we were trading it on VHS tapes. We were all trading it around our households saying, oh my God, you've got to watch this. We didn't see it on PBS. It wasn't in the theater. We were trading it around on an old VHS tape so that we could understand the story of this Black gay man's experience with HIV.
One of the things, Mark, I want to get your take, especially in the films early on. One of the things that always struck me then, and like you said, it always was. It felt like it because it was that we were watching ourselves in real time. But one of the things that I think a lot of those films did early on was show how we came together as a community to take care of our own and to take care of each other.
Well, you bring up an interesting, you bring up an interesting point.
Yeah.
And that is the debate about what AIDS did to us as a movement. As an LGBTQ movement, what did AIDS do? Did it help us because it saw us as these sympathetic victims of this disease beyond our control? Or did it hurt us because it saw people viewed us as vectors of disease? Oh, look, they're finally getting what they deserve. You know, so which way did it move the needle, right? And art reflected that, because in all of those early movies, we were tragic victims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you had AIDS in a movie, you were going to die of it, for sure. And if you were gay in a movie, you had AIDS and you were going to die of it. You know, and so the question was, did it make people feel sympathetic? And that reflected real life, because of all of the thousands of gay men who were calling home saying, "Mom, I have two things to tell you."
Right. Yes.
One, which one do you start with?
Right.
One, I'm gay. Two, I have AIDS and I'm going to be dead in a few months, right? That was the conversation that was going on via long distance all over the country, if they didn't move home entirely and have their parents take care of them in their final months. And so film was reflecting that, seeing us as victims, because our own families were seeing that. And keep in mind, this was the 80s and the early 90s. People had never seen gay people depicted on television. Most people hadn't. And the first time they did, it was a gay man who died of AIDS. That was their first exposure. And most families didn't see a gay person come out until they said, "Oh, guess what? I'm gay and I have AIDS." And then they died.
Yeah. I remember.
So did that help us or hurt us?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I think it's a question. I still don't know if we know the answer.
I would like to know what Stephen, as a younger person, thought growing up when he was seeing those images.
So I think it's a mixed bag. I think that for me to see that was it instilled a lot of fear, and for somebody who was already, you know, in the closet, it felt like a reason to stay in the closet, because it felt like you have a bleak future ahead of you. You know, like you weren't seeing images of people finding love and, you know, happiness and whatever. Everything, like Mark was saying, everything was somebody getting sick, the party's over, you're moving home, and the whole film is about people putting pieces in place for their end of life. You know, tying up relationships and making amends with people that you've hurt or that have hurt you. So that was really hard to watch, I think. From the perspective of somebody who works in HIV today, I think that they were probably valuable to people outside of the gay community, because I think that I think they made the general public more sympathetic. And I think that regardless of what people think about like accepting sexuality or whatever, I don't think anybody wants to see someone sick and suffering and ultimately dying. And so I think that for mainstream America, it was kind of a message of like, your time with these people that you are your children, your brother, your sister, whatever, may be limited. And so maybe you have to put things aside and just value the person for the time that you have them and love them while you have them, you know? So I would like to think, the optimist, the Pollyanna in me would like to think that it helped create a more sympathetic society that maybe led to us being more accepting of gay people and gay culture.
Yeah, I remember, and one thing I want to be careful of tonight is, I mean, you know, we're a film festival. We all love. I don't want to trash any film that dealt with HIV or AIDS, because they're all been important, especially in the evolution. I do remember there was some sort of after school special or some nighttime special back in the late 80s, early 90s, about a young woman who had never had sex and met a guy, and she had AIDS, and she became the innocent victim. And I just, oh, that trope just drives me crazy. The innocent victim, you know, who got AIDS and who didn't deserve it. And can y'all talk briefly about the days of the innocent victim?
Well, gee. It's funny, if there was an innocent victim, as you suggest, it wasn't a gay person.
Right.
That's what I meant.
It was some other, they were from some other population who had innocently fallen victim to our disease.
Right.
This was a
And so there was a lot of that.
straight woman who fell for a guy. So.
Yeah, right. Or the guy that wasn't being honest because he was on the down low, you know, all of that.
People who
well,
got blood transfusions.
I'm glad, yeah, blood transfusion. I'm so glad that you love film, Jim, and that you don't want to trash any film, because I do. I'm dying to trash films. I would love to trash Philadelphia, if you don't mind.
Which one?
If I may. And only to say that Philadelphia was, it tried to take every, what they thought was progressive trope and throw it in. Well, let's make him a lawyer, and let's make sure that he has, you know, a biracial relationship, but don't let him kiss, for God's sake. You're married to Antonio Banderas and you never kissed the guy? Are you out of your mind?
The sexiest man on the planet, you don't even kiss him?
Yes. Now, I do understand that was made by, who was it, Fox or some big studio. It was the first big studio AIDS movie. And okay, so maybe they had to make some concessions for that. But it was melodramatic. It was well-intentioned and awful, just awful.
I remember,
and included every kind of AIDS, stereotype that you could possibly throw in there, despite the presence of the late, great Michael Callan, the original long-term survivor who appears briefly in Philadelphia. Just an awful movie filled with bad messaging.
And I remember walking out of the theater saying that as angry as I have ever been.
Really?
I mean, just angry as I have ever been watching a film about our community and about us that I, like you, thought was just, I was just angry. I mean, like rageful anger.
Well, and it wasn't made by us, right?
Right.
Nothing with us, about us, without us.
Right.
It wasn't made by us.
It was for a straight audience, made by a straight filmmaker, and really just
and completely sanitized.
Yeah, very sanitized.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear those perspectives, and I totally respect that. I don't think it's a great film today looking at it, but I will say that it came out, I think, when I was in high school, and I remember thinking how progressive it was that Tom Hanks was playing this character. And, you know, Tom Hanks, I feel like, is kind of like America's sweetheart or whatever. So to take on that kind of role, to me at the time, as a closeted high school student, felt very like it was somebody on my side, you know? It's still a terrible tale. And again, I think reinforces a lot of negative stereotypes, all of that. I give you that. But like I said, it's just interesting to me to see the difference in perspective. And I will say that it's also like, that's kind of the Hollywood standard, right? It's like when women have to play roles like monster to win an Oscar, you know, like if you make yourself ugly, you know, or play some kind of controversial character, they're going to give you an Oscar, right? Mm-hmm. So in hindsight now, I'm like, it's not brave, it's a calculated career move, and if anything, it's capitalizing on our community.
Well, and let's not forget that Tom Hanks was so brave.
I was about
brave to play this gay man dying of AIDS that he won the Oscar.
Right.
And he,
you know, so it does happen. And, and it also speaks to, when we look at all of these films, I remember at the time that each and every one of these came out and I sought them out, I was so grateful. Oh, thank you, God. Another film about HIV. Maybe this one will be good. Maybe this one will represent us. You're so hungry for any little crumb of representation as a person living with HIV. Now, I can't imagine what it's like for you running a film festival, an LGBT film festival, because my attitude has always been, my observation has been, and maybe you don't feel this way, that we're so hungry for representation that sometimes we settle for what we can get, and it's not always good. and it's not always good. And we have to, and I don't want to lower the bar. I want to have a high bar for all art.
I think luckily we're in a situation where we get so many films every year that we do show films that we really like, that we don't have to. There's enough being made right now that we can take the cream of the crop. I wanted to. I know we talked briefly about Jeffrey earlier, but we were talking about the 80s and how most of what that came out that decade was just dire and everybody had to die. Jeffrey was, to me, kind of a turning point because it wasn't like those other movies. It had a sense of humor. It was funny. It dealt with HIV/AIDS. But for me, that was kind of a turning point. Do you all agree with that?
I do.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I do. I think it was Jeffrey, and I think, as Stephen mentioned earlier, it was Pedro.
Yeah.
I mean, I only watched that season of The Real World because Pedro was, and it was like, oh, there's a gay kid on The Real World. And like Mark said, I'll watch anything with a gay kid in it. But I do think that mid-90s seemed to be kind of a turning point, and kind of the stories that were being told, that we were telling, that were being told about us. I do think it was a turning point in that time frame.
You know, it's funny. I am still waiting because as I look at kind of the chronology of HIV film, it really starts petering out. When the tragedy ended and the tragic narrative, you don't have that, even when AIDS films happened after 95, when treatments got better and we all stopped dying, you still had Precious was 2009. And what did they do? They went back in time. Precious isn't in real time. It takes place years before, and she has to have HIV, and people die, and she doesn't die, fortunately. Right. But So I think it really thinned out after new medications came along because the stories weren't so dramatic to tell anymore. I don't know. Name 3 good HIV-centered films that have come out in the last 20 years.
I made something of a list, and it's so ironic that we're talking about 1995 with Jeffrey, because the year after, the same year, we had Boys on the Side with Whoopi Goldberg and Mary Louise Parker and Drew Barrymore that dealt with a female protagonist. I like that movie a lot. I mean, I did. It was a sad movie. But the next year we had It's My Party, which Randall Kleiser's film with Eric Roberts and Gregory Harrison, which I still think is
Margaret Cho's in it too.
Margaret Cho's in that movie. But it obviously was very sad. It had a protagonist who, spoiler, died at the end. But you're so right, Mark. It's just, you look at what's, let me read some other movies. The Hours, 2002, Angels in America on Television, 2003, Rent, 2005, Life Support on HBO, 2007. Some amazing documentaries. We Were Here in 2011 and How to Survive a Plague in 2012.
I think it's interesting how it took about 20 years for documentary film to kind of have some distance from the plague years and start chronicling it, really taking a good look at it in the way that How to Survive a Plague did. I also want to throw out, as a film geek, Craig Hardesty's film, The Living End, early Craig Hardesty, 1992. And you had 2 guys who were HIV positive and they go on a crime spree. They figure, what the fuck?
It was great.
It's outlandish. It's very almost early John Waters, no production value at all. But fascinating that the guy was edgy enough to make these guys outlaws, because that's what we were, sexual outlaws anyway. And to just take it that step further, I went, okay, this is a director to watch.
What's interesting to me is I totally agree with everything that y'all just said, that we've yet to get to a point where we can have a character who is HIV positive and it's just part of the, like being diabetic, or, people are nonplussed by it. And I think it went from having characters that were HIV positive that had to die, like that's the ultimate goal of the film, is that you're dead, to in the 90s, I felt like it really shifted to this thing about disclosure, and that a lot of times the characterizations were somebody's HIV positive and it's found out because someone discovers your medications, and then there's this whole blow up of, why didn't you tell me, you know, I had a right to know, and all of this. And so it's still kind of very much victimizing the HIV positive person. You know, it's still villainizing, you know, your disclosure and who you choose to tell and things like that. Like it's so I think it's very interesting that we, like you said, we've yet to have a really positive positive person.
Yeah, I know Steven has seen it because we did an event together, and obviously you've seen it. Mark, have you seen Paris 559, Theo and Hugo?
Yes.
That is one of my favorite films, and for those who have seen it, what I love about that movie is that it deals with HIV/AIDS, but it's not a sad movie. It's just really about the acceptance of it. How can you deal with it, and let's move on. I mean, what do y'all?
Well, you know what, and thank you for bringing that up, because you actually just proved my question earlier, which was what's gone on in the last 10 years that's progressive. That's a great example of it. That is a French film that starts in a sex club.
Yeah.
For any of you watching that would like to get it, you can get it on Amazon Prime, and it starts in a sex club. And when I say sex clubs, I mean erect penises, people.
For 18 minutes.
Are in this movie. So if that doesn't get you to watch it, I don't know what will. But anyway, it starts in a sex club, and so there's and what happens is you got a negative guy and a positive guy who meet in a sex club, and they decide they like each other, so they go for a long walk. And the movie's just about their long walk and them getting to know each other. But here you have a positive guy who's undetectable, and you have a negative guy who isn't on PrEP, but they stop at a clinic so he can take the pills afterwards, PEP, post-exposure. So that he can take some pills, and so he downs his pills, and then they continue for a walk, falling in love. It is wonderfully progressive about his messages about you know, being sex positive, and the interplay between people who are positive and people who are negative. We're not enemies. We can work together. You know, all these wonderful messages. I'm so glad you brought up that movie. I really overlooked it when it comes to contemporary movies that got it right.
And it's sexy and also really romantic.
Yeah, it is.
In the end.
It is.
Very, I mean, you wouldn't think that going to a clinic is romantic, but it's really, there's really such a romantic element.
Yes.
That whole after the sex club.
Yeah. Erect penises.
Yeah. For 18 minutes.
It's so funny because that movie's reputation was about the first 18 minutes, which, listen, is erotic as hell. I mean, we sat in an audience like, whoa, but it's so much more. It's got so much heart, and I love the message of that movie. I love it. It's really about these two guys falling in love and just how do we move to the next step. And it's just,
and repeat the name of the film for people who might want to know.
Paris 559, Theo and Hugo from actually, when was that film?
It was a couple years ago.
I had the wrong year written down. I have 2017.
It's just a few years ago. I want to say it's 2016. I mean, it's recent.
It's
very recent. Yeah.
Yes. Paris 559.
Yeah.
It is interesting that that those are foreign. That it's a foreign film. It takes that to cover something like that, and you know, instead, U.S. wants to put out Fast and the Furious 15. You know.
Yeah.
Like I wonder why we feel that American audiences aren't necessarily ready for something like that or accepting of something like that. I just think that's. I feel like anything we would get would be like a documentary, you know.
Yeah.
Well, or something on Netflix or Amazon.
Yeah.
You know, where the courageous filmmaking is happening these days.
Well, and I will say again, not to get off of film, but I do think we are making progress because, of course, you know, like we have like Pose today, and I have to say I'm watching the current season of Pose, and even though it still deals very heavily with people who are in the early days of HIV, I feel like they have a much more positive attitude and more like more fight in them, you know, and they aren't painted in such a negative perspective.
You know, I was going to say we can't have this conversation, or we certainly can't end it without talking about Pose,
Yeah.
regardless of being a film or not. And certainly my friends of color, and certainly my trans folk friends will say, you know, what a monumental, you know, just a monumental achievement this is, that this got on the air. Kudos to Ryan Murphy and his whole crew, that this got on the air. And that this featured a cast of primarily trans women. And this is, okay, so that's all great, right? And then over the course of 3 seasons, he reduces it to a melodrama that could be on TNT any night of the week. I mean, you know, that is my criticism of Pose, is that he turned it into a melodrama in which all of these marginalized characters end up with money, in the mainstream, married and in love. It's like he wanted them to live happily ever after, and he turned it into a
fairy tale.
You know, a fairy tale, a melodrama that has nothing to do with the real lived lives of those folks. And they will be the first to tell you that. Now, you know, I'm not going to speak for my Black trans friends about what they may or may not think of it. They can speak for themselves. But I think reviews are mixed about how that was handled.
I think,
and yet I'm so happy for everybody in that show, and I wish them all long careers.
Yeah, I think TV has been kind of cutting edge in dealing with HIV. I'm looking at shows that have dealt with HIV/AIDS. Obviously, The Real World we talked about. I remember an early episode of Designing Women with Tony Goldwyn. That was back in 1987. Life Goes On. Remember Chad Lowe and Patti LuPone? Life Goes On. 30-something. Queer as Folk. Noah's Ark. Looking. The Tales of the City reboot. When We Rise. It's a Sin from this year. But I think the one that really has broken ground, and we've all talked about it, is Pose, because it does finally deal with people of color, because that has been, something that we have not seen a lot over the years. And Pose for me has broken a lot of ground, and just really, it's been so amazing that it's been around. Are there any other TV projects or films that we haven't discussed that really we look at as being sort of symbolic or really, really important in the last 40 years?
You've done your homework. I think that's a really great list that you just, it's going to be interesting to see as we post-AIDS. In other words, the depictions of LGBTQ people post-AIDS. And by that, I mean, maybe some are positive, maybe they're not, maybe it comes up, maybe it doesn't. It's not as if they're ignoring it. They're just living they're reflecting the reality of the fact that HIV isn't on the surface of our community in the way that it once was. And so it's fair for those depictions not to have it on the surface anymore either. Although maybe it comes up in this kind of offhanded way down the line. That is for those with privilege, right? And so as long as we're telling the stories of white gay men, HIV can pretty much stay in the background. It's not in the background, right? For people of color, for Black trans women, for all of those populations. And like everything else, who gets to tell your story?
Right, exactly.
Do you get to tell your story,
Yeah, I want to throw in one more TV show, but I'm going to let you ask the final question. I think a TV show that oftentimes gets overlooked for dealing with HIV and AIDS is How to Get Away with Murder. I mean, because that show was very progressive in dealing with like PrEP in positive relationships. I mean, what did y'all watch much of?
I think it has the PrEP storyline and the sexiest sex in the stockroom scene that I've seen since the days of William Higgins in the early 80s. I mean, that was pretty hot stuff.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that, and I had totally forgotten about that, which maybe is good that it has mainstreamed to a point that it falls off of our radar. But I also just wanted to say that as much as I like to see HIV positive characters and the shift in the portrayal of those, I continue to hope that we will see more HIV positive celebrities. And I was really pleased with Billy Porter recently coming out with his status and sharing that. And of course, that's a very personal thing. I'm not trying to force anyone to disclose anything they're not comfortable with, but it seems like it would benefit everybody to have more celebrities who were open about their status, and then to be viewed in roles where that wasn't an issue. So I hope that that will happen more as we move forward.
You know, I appreciate that so much. And you know, they're out there, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are out there. It's funny, Jim, you opened this interview by talking about the MMWR, the CDC report from June 5th, 1981. That report was written by a Dr. Michael Gottlieb, who was reporting on those 5 gay men who had those mysterious illnesses. Michael Gottlieb was my doctor in Los Angeles during that time, or shortly thereafter, after I tested positive. And I interviewed him a couple of months ago for this occasion, and talked about Rock Hudson, who was his client. Mm-hmm. And I said something about, there just must be so many. And he said, I'm their doctor. There are, you know, and they're perfectly happy and perfectly healthy, right? Because they're undetectable and they're living their lives, and they're not coming forward. To have, not only to have somebody who was HIV positive and undetectable like Billy Porter is, to have a gay person come forward and say, I'm on PrEP, a gay celebrity saying I'm taking PrEP, and not, you know, just more. We want more representation. That's probably a tune you sing all the time.
Exactly.
So I do want to ask, I am curious to get your take, both of your takes on, you know, as we're talking about, you know, representation, you know, one of the things I have noticed of late is that there have been the movies and the TV shows currently that are set in the 80s. We had like 1985 a couple of years ago. Pose is set in the 80s. It's a Cinema set in the 80s. There is a documentary that's coming out on Pedro Zamora. Why do you think now is the time that we're reflecting and looking back? What do you make of
I don't think you can process it in real time, and it's not just film, it's books.
Right.
If you look at all the memoirs coming out of the big AIDS activists from the 80s, you know, Sean Strube, Peter Staley, Sarah Schulman, Cleve Jones, whose book only came out 8 years ago. We really needed a couple of decades to process what happened to us and how do we feel about it and what is its place in history and the big picture. I don't think that we were ready to write about it, and I don't think the general public was ready to hear about it.
Yeah.
They needed some space to get past the trauma of it all before we were ready to look critically at it from a narrative point of view or a documentary point of view.
I would just add to that too, that I think culturally we lost an entire generation of people, and there were so many people who I think would have told those stories are gone. And so I think it took time to have people rediscover some of those stories and to have a new generation of storytellers crop up who wanted to take up that mantle and say, this is something that needs to be shared, you know, and these are names that need to not be forgotten. So I think that has something to do with it as well.
Yeah, we something else that's been pretty big this year is the series It's Its Thing, which had a lot of audience members to watch it. But I wanted to just sort of close out with one final little question. We've looked at the last 40 years. Where do we need to go in the next 10 years or 15 years? What do both of you hope that you see more of on television and film over the next 5-10 years?
We've got to see more marginalized people whose stories have not been told. You know, it should not be 30 years since Marlon Riggs made a splash, right? People should be handed the mic and find ways to tell their stories. More and more like that is happening. There have been a lot more Black filmmakers and writers on the scene, and so maybe we will get to see more HIV storylines as it relates to Black men and women, but that's what's missing from the picture.
Okay.
I agree with that. It's just kind of breaking the glass ceiling and just empowering other voices, and giving people the opportunities to tell their stories, and I think also just kind of normalizing all of our stories, that like there is no homogeny, there is no monolithic voice of the human experience. And, you know, part of the reason that I love going to the movies or watching TV or listening to music is because it exposes me to something that is outside of my own experience. And I think that makes us all, we're all better for that.
I think that's a lovely note to end on. Mark, Stephen, thank you for joining us in this conversation. I think it's an important topic and conversation to have as we are coming up on the 40th anniversary, and that we're still talking about it, and that we're still living with it, we're still talking about it, and moving forward and moving on. So thank you both for joining us, and thank all of you out there for joining us here at Out on Film. If you like this conversations and others like it, please subscribe to our channel. And with that, have a great evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.